Okay, everyone, we are setting up for the student panel from students from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies right here in Monterey. The student panel consists of Kaio Oda, Joseph Rogers, and Paul Wernke. And the title of this panel is Transformative Education and Non-Proliferation and Disarmament.
Okay, so thank you all for being here and coming to Monterey. And it's been inspiring for me to see some of your presentations. And it's great to hear so many young people involved in nuclear politics and studying these issues. So we're going to give brief introductions of ourselves and move on to a question and answer session. And I think that Kaio is going to present first, and then Paul, and then I'll give a brief introduction of sort of our experiences in the nuclear politics field and sort of how we ended up here at MIIS.
All right, so the whole point of this panel is to give you an example of how your life could be, or you might not choose to be. So I'm just going to tell you why I'm here. I am an alumna of Hiroshima Jogakuin, and when I say I'm from Hiroshima, people automatically think that I'm studying non-proliferation because I'm from Hiroshima. But that's not really it. When I was at your age, I went to school to play basketball. I didn't want to study, and my grades were low, like really low. But I had this vague idea that I wanted to work in humanitarian aid. And when you say humanitarian aid, there are various means and topics. It could be water, sanitation, hygiene. It could be food security. It could be conflict resolutions. But I didn't know what topic. Even when I did my undergraduate in Canada, I didn't know. But I knew that I wanted to work in humanitarian aid. So after undergraduate, I decided to work in the business world. Because yesterday, I remember we had, was it Kaki? She was talking about being pessimistic and idealistic. I had this fear of being too idealistic, and I wanted to put myself in the business world so that I know what to do. What I learned in the business world is that they are very time and cost effective, which we don't find in many of the government and international organizations. I worked in business working with real estate, large-scale real estate developments for 5 years. I'm really glad I did that because now I have the skill of project management, which many people in this field do not have, unfortunately. So I did that, and I used that skill in my second job. I worked in non-governmental organization called AAR Japan, and I was dispatched to Sudan, worked as a program coordinator and then country director for a total of 2.5 years. It was a difficult time, but I learned a lot. During that time, I had decided that I wanted to focus on emergency. So when you talk about humanitarian aid, there are 3 phases: emergency, recovery, and developments. I touched on all those projects when I was working in Sudan and Afghanistan. And I decided that development is not my thing. And instead of recovery, yes, I want to focus on emergency. And when I looked back my path, the biggest project I had was on landmines and other explosive devices. So I told myself, so why not focusing on arms? Then I decided to study chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons here at MIIS. What I'm hoping to do is that when I was in Sudan, our organization created national strategic framework for victim assistance program, for landmine victim assistance program in Sudan. That was something government should have done, but it was too much work for a government worker who gets minimum salary and not enthusiastic to work hard. So we took that job. In many countries, they need people like us who are willing to work hard. So I'm hoping to learn more about chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and utilize my skill in some of the developing countries. And that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming. Oops, sorry. So I think my name is Paul Warnke. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I actually went to Middlebury College for undergrad. And I think in many ways my kind of career and academic arc, what's led me to here, is very similar to Kaio's in the sense that I think I experimented with a lot of different things. And it was kind of marked more by trial and error than it was by a long-term kind of vision. At Middlebury College, I majored in history. I also studied abroad in Brazil for a semester. And after graduating from Middlebury, my main goal was to get back to Brazil. So I lived in Sao Paulo for a year where I was a paralegal for a law firm. And actually, law school was kind of one of my goals. So I spent a year living in Sao Paulo and was a paralegal at a New York City law firm that had an office in Brazil. I quickly learned, though, that perhaps the law firm environment was not right for me and that law school was not in the cards. So I returned back to the US and then worked at a political risk consulting firm in DC, which I also learned was not perhaps my right career path. So I think what kind of drew me to this field, to nonproliferation disarmament, was partly a family connection. My grandfather was also Paul Warnke, which is kind of a blessing and a curse, having the same name as him. But he worked in the McNamara Defense Department under Lyndon Johnson, and then he was the chief negotiator for SALT II, which was an arms control agreement with the Soviet Union under the Carter administration. So it's kind of, I guess, in the family, nuclear issues. So that was one draw. And then I think the other draw, especially for this program, was the kind of interdisciplinary nature of nonproliferation studies. This studies packages together history, political science, science, physics, even game theory, even psychology and law. So even if this is a very niche field at the same time, and what attracts me the most is that it is very broad in the sense that it combines various areas of discipline. And I think this kind of interdisciplinary nature of the program has kind of shaped what I've done as well in the field. So I guess as a kind of brief overview of what I've done, last fall I interned at the UN in New York for the Office of Disarmament Affairs, where I kind of focused on the diplomatic and legal aspects of the disarmament regime. I was there for, UN week, where I saw, Trump give his memorable Rocket Man speech, which was interesting to kind of bear witness to history, but also terrifying. I also I wrote speeches for Azumi Nakamitsu, who is the high rep for disarmament affairs. And actually, I think one of my perhaps most memorable moments was I somehow fell into speech writing for her, and I wrote the speech that she delivered in Hiroshima for the United Nations Japan Conference on Disarmament Issues, an annual event where the Japanese government hosts a UN kind of discussion in Japan. So that writing that speech was something that I really enjoyed. It's kind of hard to write in UN language, but I slowly got the feel of it. I've also I interned at the State Department last summer, where I kind of focused more on the technical side and safeguards. So I think in my experiences, I've kind of dabbled in the different areas of nonproliferation studies, looking at the kind of historical elements, looking at the diplomatic elements, the legal elements. And I think that's what interests me the most, is that this kind of multifaceted nature of the field. So now pass to Joseph.
So, yeah. So I'm going to talk briefly about sort of how I became interested in the field, some of my experiences in the field, and some of the lessons that I think are worth sharing with all of you. But the overarching theme that I've learned through my experience in nuclear issues is that you can make a career by expressing interest, being passionate about these issues, and seizing opportunities as they come. So the way that I fell into this weird world of nuclear politics and talking about the end of the world all of the time is through debate. Immediately after high school, I started I participated in speech and debate, and I was able to travel around California. I'm from California, and debated about a variety of issues, but the issue that was most interesting was nuclear war and nuclear weapons, and how the risks associated with nuclear weapons and steps that we can take to reduce those risks. As I debated more and more through my community college, I realized that there have been many instances of accidental near-nuclear war, and that was absolutely frightening to me. And so I kind of fell interested in sort of how we can take steps to reduce the current risks. And then I started getting some experience in the field. I first interned as an undergrad at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., and I was there during the Senate debates of the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And so I was able to witness some of the very interesting and articulate arguments in the Senate about the Iran deal. And I also was able to work at the Arms Control Association on something that I found very interesting, which is the interconnection between arms control in space and nuclear weapons, and sort of that's something that I've focused on a bit since then. After I graduated, I worked with a number of nonprofits working in Washington, D.C. and here in California, lobbying for environmental cleanup of nuclear waste and disarmament. And through these smaller nonprofits, collectively called the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, I was able to have the opportunity to travel to Geneva and attend one of the negotiating sessions for the ban treaty. And that was really, my first time at the United Nations, and it was a very exciting moment for me, and it was very eye-opening to see sort of this exciting negotiation of a treaty between a bunch of countries. Since then, I have came to MIIS, started my school work here, and interned last semester at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, also in Geneva. And I worked on verification of disarmament research. So we produced several research papers on verifying disarmament, as well as arms control in space. And throughout all of this, some of the two kind of lessons that I've learned is that first, I think that collectively our youth can be our advantage, and I think that we don't realize some of the skills that we have simply as younger people growing up in this space of technology and social networks. We're very familiar with the ways that we can use technology, such as the Nagasaki archives and things like this, and share them on VK and Facebook and our extensive social networks. And I think that that's something that we have the ability to leverage at different organizations that work in non-proliferation. And secondly, the second lesson that I've pulled is that these opportunities kind of lead one to the next. One opportunity comes from the next. And if you are able to be passionate, make mistakes, and learn from them, and be willing to sort of reach out for the next opportunity, then you can kind of make a path in this nuclear political space, and I strongly encourage you all, if you're interested, to sort of look for opportunities, and I think that you'll find that there are plenty. So that is our introductions. I think that we'd like to jump to Q&A. I think that one thing I'd like to say before we jump to Q&A is I realize that this is this year's Critical Issue Forum is about the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, and so if I could ask my two colleagues here what they sort of their opinions on the ban treaty, but most specifically, I'm interested in knowing what role we think that non-nuclear weapon states can play in furthering disarmament, and sort of how the role of non-nuclear weapon states plays with the ban treaty and sort of the interconnection there.
Okay. I am a little ashamed to admit that I am pessimistic. Admitting that in front of Susan is very shameful. But so I really don't know whether we can achieve disarmament before I die. But the only disappointment that I have with ban treaty and the whole discussion around ban treaty is that they focus too much on whether ban treaty is legitimate or it will interfere with NPT. We have to admit the fact that ban treaty exists because of the disappointment with the stagnant process in disarmament. So even in the field of NPT or ban treaty, we share the same goal. And it is easier for non-nuclear weapon states to let nuclear weapon states realize that even NPT should be looking at disarmament, and we're looking at the same direction. Even though we all share the same responsibility, I believe that non-nuclear weapon states are in easier position to refocus on disarmament.
So I guess I'll jump in as well then. So I'm too a little pessimistic, and I think one thing grad school does to you is it makes you pretty jaded. I definitely adhere to the kind of vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, and I believe that should be the objective of the international community. I think the ban treaty was perhaps not the right way of doing it. I think that if you look at past treaties, the process of how they were negotiated, it took the NPT, it took the international community 5 years to negotiate the NPT, from 1962 to 1967. It took 50 years from the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, it took 30 years from the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963 to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. So as you see, I think the process of making treaties it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's even a series of marathons. And the way the ban treaty was negotiated, it was negotiated, I think, in a 1-week session and then a 3-week session. So it took essentially a month to negotiate one of the most significant treaties in the disarmament field. So I think that the international community approached it more as a kind of 100-meter dash than a marathon. And I think that that plays out in the treaty itself, where I think there are some kind of holes, some loopholes. Rather than going into specifics, I think it's not exactly a watertight treaty, and that the main purpose of the treaty was to get short-term political gain. I believe that non-nuclear weapon states, though, can play a huge role in advancing disarmament. I think, for instance, the NATO countries can pressure the U.S. To extend New START, which expires in 2021. It's the major arms control agreement with Russia. They can put more pressure on the nuclear weapon states to ratify the CTBT, which has yet to enter into force. I think they can also put pressure on the Conference on Disarmament to advance the FMCT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. So I think there are many different routes that non-nuclear weapons can take. We'll see where the ban treaty goes. If it's ratified by 50 countries, then that it enters into force, and that could happen in the next 3 years. So yeah, that's my position. And Joseph and I, we've had many disagreements on this. So he comes from, I think, a different viewpoint, which will be interesting to hear.
Certainly. So I support the sentiment and the symbolic value of the nuclear weapons ban treaty, and I think that it is indeed unfortunate that nuclear weapon states are not participating, chose not to attend, but nonetheless they had the opportunity to attend, and I think that one strong criticism that people make of the ban treaty is that nuclear weapon states didn't participate, but they chose not to. I think that the world that we live in is very scary. There are several proposals for modernization in the US and Russia, and I mean in all of the nuclear weapon states really. And these massive, it's a new arms race, and I think that it's very important that states issue at least symbolic statements. This treaty, I think, is a very symbolic treaty, and I think that it's very important that states take a stance against this massive spending that is going on that I think we would all agree probably makes our world very much so less secure with, scary new proposals like nuclear-powered cruise missiles and more submarine-launched cruise missiles from the U.S. side. But I support the treaty. I think that there is symbolic value, and yeah. So if you have any questions for us, we'd love to.
We can tell you how graduate school can make you pessimistic.
My name is Rio Tarahoma.
Hi.
And I'm from Kaisei High School. And I have one question. And this is about the ban treaty. And the ban treaty gets entered into force once 50 countries have ratified the treaty. And I think that, doesn't that ignore the rights of other countries? For example, if the 50 countries are all non-nuclear weapon states, then doesn't that ignore the rights of the nuclear weapon states because they have to forfeit their nuclear weapons even though they don't want to?
Thank you very much for the question. So when 50 states ratify the treaty enters into force, like you said. But if a nuclear weapon state does not sign on to the treaty and ratify it, it is not bound by the provisions of the treaty. So, for instance, India and Pakistan are not parties to the NPT, which means that they don't have to adhere to the rules of the NPT. So I think you're very right in the sense that nuclear weapon states will not sign on to this treaty. They are only bound to disarm if they sign on to the treaty.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, so I just wanted to thank all three of you. It was really interesting to hear about your backgrounds and also your stances on the ban treaty. I was just wondering what are some biggest challenges that you've faced in working in this field and how you've overcome it, or if you're still in the process of overcoming it?
Working in this field.
Yeah.
So the biggest challenges I've had, I had a lot of difficulties, but oftentimes, any jobs that you have to work with people, and people from different backgrounds, and they just don't work in the way you want them to, or oftentimes. So when I was working in Sudan, we spoke Arabic, and there was a word called inshallah. Does anyone know? So good. So it means in God's will. It's a great word. I use that all the time too. But oftentimes they used it in a bad way. When I ask someone, can you finish this by Monday? And they will say, inshallah. So if they cannot get things done by Monday, it's God's will. That frustrated me so much. And in that kind of cultural differences, I encountered a lot and I suffered a lot. And I will continue to suffer. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I guess the big challenges I face, and I think one thing to remember and that I've kind of embraced is that trial and error is kind of what careers are about. I've tried, I've worked or interned at the UN, I've interned at the State Department, I've interned at think tanks. So I think experimentation is something that we should all embrace. I think there's kind of a tendency or pressure when you graduate from college or from grad school to immediately find the perfect job. Unless you're very lucky, usually it takes time to find that perfect job. But I think that experimenting is trying even different things within the field, or even trying things outside the field. Like going abroad right after graduating from college can really help out in the long run. So for instance, when I was a paralegal in Brazil, I did capital markets law, something that is completely unrelated to nonproliferation. But and kind of being in this kind of legal environment, I think recognized certain skills in terms of being attentive to detail that plays a role in this field. So I think but the takeaway is for me is don't be afraid to try different things, experiment, especially go abroad, and yeah.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one more question. Take two. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes. So at this point, my name is Sukrit. I'm from the Harker School. So at this point, basically every country except for Pakistan, India, North Korea, they've all signed the NPT, but basically no one has ratified the ban treaty. So why do you think that is? Because according to the terms of the NPT, they can't start their own nuclear programs, but yet they're still unwilling to sign the ban treaty, even though they know it'll be better for the world if we eliminate nuclear weapons somehow.
Yeah, one more.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm just curious, in your studies and your work in the field of nuclear politics, could you talk about the range of perspectives viewing nuclear weapons between a threat and a privilege, and kind of the in-betweens of that?
Which one do you want to answer?
So I'll try to answer the question about the de facto nuclear weapon states, and then we'll divide it after that. So I think that, Israel, North Korea, India, and Pakistan are, like other nuclear weapon states, not likely to be, sign on to the ban treaty, be proponents of the ban treaty. When interesting, and I don't read too much into this, but North Korea has had some interesting stances on the ban treaty, voting for the negotiation one time of the ban treaty. But nonetheless, I don't see nuclear weapon states taking nuclear weapon states and de facto nuclear weapon states taking strong stances for the ban treaty. I think that the point of the ban treaty is not necessarily to create a world free of nuclear weapons tomorrow with the backing of nuclear weapon states. I think that the point is it's a symbolic gesture by non-nuclear weapon states against the current political environment of massive modernization by all of the possessing states, trillions of dollars being spent in a new arms race and not so much actually trying to get nuclear weapon states and de facto states to sign on.
I'm going to answer the second question. So difference between nuclear weapons, difference between privilege and threat, right? So nuclear weapons being privileged, I think it was in one of the presentations today, in the case of France, that they should not feel nuclear threat. In my understanding, their motivation of having nuclear weapon is privilege. But in the case of North Korea, I do think it's a threat, and that's the threat that Japanese citizens are fearing. But as a Japanese citizen, I feel like we are fearing the fear more than fearing nuclear weapons. And that's what scares me. In the poll last year, I have found that Japanese, more than any other, Americans or Russian or South Koreans, we are for the idea of military action against North Korea because of our fear growing. And I am very scared of that.
So I guess I'll also piggyback off that and answer the second question as well, between the kind of distinction between threat and privilege and how nuclear weapons can be viewed as a threat or a privilege. I think this difference is kind of what divides the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states in the international community. Nuclear weapon states view their nuclear weapons as kind of instruments of statecraft. Weapons that are, the source of their security, weapons that are the foundation of deterrence and the foundation of security alliances. Whereas non-nuclear weapon states, I think, view them as, these existential threats that have the capacity to, essentially end the world. And that this division of how, the ban treaty proponents view nuclear weapons as this deep existential danger, and nuclear weapon states that view it as perhaps their kind of security backstop, the weapon that is the source of their international status as well as the source of their security. Bridging these views is probably the biggest challenge, I think. And I think the ban treaty was one way to somehow delegitimize nuclear weapons as sources of privilege and really reaffirm their role as sources of threat. I think that this divide, though, is at the moment unbridgeable.
Fantastic. Well, I think that we have a break now, and so if you'd like to talk to us, I think we'll be around. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present, and thanks.